Vado?
Sì, puoi andare, siamo in leggero anticipo, ma per qualche minuto va bene.
Allora.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank the organizers for this beautiful event. It's a good forum, and it's a good opportunity to meet people we haven't seen in a while. We will be talking about critical factors for the evolution of long-lived white wine. This is a curve we've seen several times. For each wine, there's an assumption in terms of maturation, maturity, and decline. This curve applies to white wine specifically because there are fewer intrinsic defenses, and so white wines are prone to decline, specifically in terms of oxidation. Why do we talk about longevity? Because longevity has changed over time. In the past, longevity was about a micro niche of white wines that lasted up to 10 years, high-end products, but from a quantitative point of view, there were not many. The idea of longevity has changed because the word has changed and the word has widened. Think of white wines. We should sell them to other countries too, but if we sell these wines in Florida or in Singapore, we do not know when these wines will be drunk. This is why these wines should be equipped with specific defenses, otherwise it could be subject to oxidation or reduction. So when we talk about longevity, we should extend the maturity period. Instead of 6 months, 2 or 3 years, and this is good for the industry, and this is good in terms of wine management, and this is good for the company, for the farm. Wines should be intrinsically stable, and this entails something else, the evolution of the idea of stability. In the past, stability meant getting rid of anything that could be a problem. If I do that, wine could be poorer in terms of quality, but it could last longer. This is true from a certain points of view. However, there's a new kind of winemaking practice which is conservative in keeping all properties of wines, because if we get rid of something that bothers us, we could get rid of other qualities too. So I'm not going to share anything new with you. I like to review some key steps of the supply chain for white wines. First of all, mashing. What happens during mashing? I like to focus on something that is taken for granted. During mashing, there are two enzymatic pathways, the polyphenol oxidase chain and the lipoxygenase pathway. The first and the second chains have different impacts. The second one, for instance, vegetal aromas, but there are other variables that could be taken into consideration. machine in oxidation or in reduction. So you know that the lipoxygenase happens in specific conditions. It's an oxidative chain that creates 6-carbon atom aldehydes. What we're interested in is the trans-2-ethanol and the ethanol, and we'll see why. And for years we have tried to reduce the concentration of these compounds with physical methods. We changed the presses, how grapes are handled. We looked for more gentle treatments, because if the grapes are not treated properly, then this chain is triggered, and there is no wine with vegetal notes that are due to this kind of aromas. But things are changing, because this chain could become an opportunity to, should we reduce it and make it to zero? On some wines, on some grapes, there are some contents that are higher than expected, and research helps us from our point of view. The trans-2-hexanol that is created here can be attached to glutathione to get a precursor that is quite effective. So we do understand that what we consider a catastrophe becomes a potential if we use it properly. And aldehydes are formed less than in the past, because we harvest grapes which are more mature. But there's the glutathione, and glutathione is present, and when this process triggers, this compound is formed. At the beginning, it was considered a Sauvignon varietal, but it is everywhere. I call it a technological aroma because it depends on the technology which is used. And other authors say that it shouldn't attach to cysteine because this sulfide acid is created and it is attached to hexanol. And we have an aroma which is stable. And then there's another pathway which is something that frightens many producers. I'm referring to polyphenol oxidase. And the polyphenol oxidase of the grapes create quinones, the first oxidation compounds that start oxidate something else. The redox reactions are always coupled, so when quinones oxidate something else, specifically ascorbic acid, it creates caphtoric acid that oxidates, so a process is started, and the ascorbic acid ends and the glutathione ends. And this is a criticism to this kind of technology. It's glutathione and exits from the system to get the GRP. But what we're interested in is that the quinones attacks the catechins, which are a source of instability in white wines, unlike red wines. So catechins are subject to oxidation, to direct polymerization, to other kinds of polymerization, and this means that there are some problems. What do we do with this pathway? So we could accept it, or we could block it. And if we want to block it, we can add CO2, and in a couple of minutes the consumption of oxygen is stopped. Then we could add new generation presses at controlled atmosphere, and then if we comply with the specific conditions, we obtain wines in reduction, but SO2 should be added on grapes because the first must, which is obtained, should find an inhibiting factor. If I don't do that, we have made hyperoxygenation for years, because 60 or 70% of the process I mentioned before has already happened at the exit of the pressing stage. What is the difference here between these two techniques? The difference is that if I add oxygen, I attack the catechins, and the wine is intrinsically stable, less browning then. If I do the reduction, I keep everything, but I pay a price because wines become much more sensible. The catechins want to oxidate. So I should protect it for the whole supply chain up to consumption. Otherwise, I have to find alternative methods to get rid of it. And on top of that, there are other effects. The role of maceration. We are talking about pre-fermentation, maceration. We know the pros and cons of this kind of macerations. The pros are what we look for in terms of the extraction of aromas that can make the product specific, but we extract some parts of the phenolic extraction too, which is the most reactive, and this is what we have to deal with. And these techniques can be combined. There could be pre-fermentation maceration without CO2, and I extract the catechins which are extracted, but if there is hyperoxidation, the aromatic fraction is extracted, it's there. Then hyperoxidation, I attack the catechins, which means that the wine is stable with a good structure because the heaviest phenolic fraction is there. Here you see the voltammetry. It's quite an old age method in chemistry, but it's quite recent for winemaking. So here, from one of the axes, the x-axis, you see a potential. These data refer to potential in volt, 100 to 100 millivolts, and then you have current in the y-axis, microampere. What do we see? We subject the sample to controlled oxidation. the oxidation process starts, which means that the current increases and these curves go upwards. What kind of information do we have here? Well, first of all, the current, if the current increases, the system can be oxidized much better. And so it oxidates, much better. Oxidizes. And if there is more current, it means that there is more substance. And let's consider the highest number, the orange curve, and this is hyper reduction. SO2 is added, the fermentation starts, and this is the end of the fermentation. What do we see? In any case, with the phenolic extraction starts oxidize earlier, even if there is no maceration, but you just work in reduction, you protect everything which is extracted. The central curve is the result of maceration and hyperoxidation. As you can see, it is lower at the beginning, and then it increases, it goes upwards, which means that the phenolic fraction is extracted and part of it is still there. The lowest curve is the wine without maceration but with hyperoxidation, and it's up to me to decide whether I should consider the structure or if this is a good choice for my kind of wine. After this stage, after this choice, it is the fermentation stage. Let's not consider what relates to fermentation. Why do I show this slide? Because the metabolism of sulfur is quite complex and not well known. The result is that if there is a lack of nutrition, specifically nitrogen, sulfuric acid could be created, and thiols too. And these thiols should be handled and based on our knowledge. So what do we do? Aeration, if there is just this gas, I can use aeration, but hydrogen sulfide is quite reactive. It can react to aldehydes and it can react to other compounds, and yeasts can create the formation of methanol, and so aeration could create problems. We use lees, we use wood specific for high-end premium wine, barrique on lees, the combination of wood and lees and tannin means self-regulation of redox, and the potential odorous compounds are blocked. Wood plays an important role, but if we work on commercial wines, there's something else that helps us. Adjuvants, yeast derivatives are a buzzword. Tannins, which have been neglected, they are consolidated for red wines when there are already some grams of tannins. As for white wines, we have 200 to 250 milligrams liter, and the balance is completely different, so we needed to adjust the tannins properly, and there's the copper. Let's have a look at what happens. Aeration, the use of air, of oxygen, can hide the defect because methanol has a perception threshold of 0 to ppb, and so it could create dimethyl disulfide. And if there are 5 ppb of dimethyl disulfide, it doesn't smell bad, so the problem is solved apparently. But this reaction is reversible. When you bottle the wine and you add a screw tap with tin foil, the context becomes reducing and the methanol comes back in all its beauty. So this is not the right solution. This is not the right way. Or better, this is just a point of view for the solution. But if we consider what happens with lees and yeast derivatives, if the methanol is not linked to itself but to a brick, so immunoproteins, membranes, proteins, yeast derivatives, and lees. In this case, when you clean the lees, you get rid of the odor if you treat the lees properly, and if the environment is slightly oxidative, which means that you need to keep the potential so that there is no reduction of disulfide. And some authors consider copper as well as a sort of bridge towards yeast walls. There's another solution which could be envisaged: tannins and wood. Traditionally, lees and barrique or tonneau are helpful. Some studies were conducted 25 years ago, and they showed that the reduction of thiols, if there are tannins and oxygen, well, this is a more elegant way to reduce this compound, and the reaction of thiols with quinones makes it possible to get rid of what smells bad. And potential oxidations. What are the critical points? We've talked about intrinsic stability. We have considered the macro parameters which can question this intrinsic stability. So the type of aroma and the quantity of simple phenols. We often underestimate other families, specifically metals. We consider metals only as in specific conditions. And otherwise we don't consider metals, but iron in synergy with copper specifically is the main trigger of oxidation chains. Oxygen doesn't want to react with the phenolic fraction or with alcohol to create aldehydes. If I leave a bottle of alcohol open after 2 years, it is still alcohol, but oxygen does react with iron, and it triggers a chain of reactions that lead to the formation of ketones and the catechins too, and the formation of aldehydes because of the oxidation of the alcohol fraction acetaldehyde, but other aldehydes as well, specifically phenylacetaldehyde that has a sort of honey smell. So iron is a catalyst that starts a chain of reactions. If you have polyphenols that can easily oxidize, the problem is major, and copper has its say. Synergy between copper and iron. Copper can oxidize too, and we should ask ourselves a question: if some copper is accepted before bottling, both for red wines and white wines, we have must and grapes that do contain some copper, 0.15, 0.20 after the whole process. And it is what we do is dosing copper to prevent the presence of ethyolic compounds. And as you can see, copper is a catalyst of oxidation, which could make things worse because the degradation phenomena start. So for longevity, this is not a good solution. Here you see what aldehydes can do, and acetaldehyde plays a very important role, but aldehydes can react with alcohol, with thiols, with catechins for browning. This means that there is a degradation of the product. This is why this should be avoided. The starting point should be the fact that there are catalysts and a phenolic fraction. What can we do? We should reproduce what normally happens in premium wines. We combine wood, lees, in order to protect our product, and we know that this technique works. I'm going to show you some data about voltammetry that can be very useful and interesting to follow these processes. Here you see 4 barriques, different ages, first, second, third, fourth passage, and there are not many differences, but after 1 month, barrique number 1, the blue one, the blue curve, is the highest because it releases a phenolic fraction, but the profiles are quite similar. After 5 months, you see that in the heaviest part, there is an increase, while in the lowest part there is an increase because wood does release phenolic fraction, and this phenomenon continues. But you can see that what we can do is having a snapshot of what is going on, that wine is becoming more and more structured, and it is more and more reactive to other elements which do not bother us. What we're interested in is the first part of this process, and as a conclusion, the critical point, enzymes in musts, and a philosophical choice, oxidation or reduction. And of course, we should consider metals, and I can't put all my wine in barrique. I need to find the right solution. I need to find the right solution to make these parameters normals, reducing catechins, PVP for instance. I should try to reduce metals as well. And there are important studies about the use of these compounds, PVP and PVI, in must. We obtain wines with cleaner aromas, and chitosan plays a very important role. It has great effects in terms of reducing metals. It plays a very important role because it combines with the oxidized phenolic fraction. So I shouldn't get rid of everything that bothers me, but I should adopt a specific approach to reduce some specific elements, some specific substances by applying specific techniques. And I'm referring to the techniques that help us to make the product stable. So, how do I replicate the evolution in barrique? You can use tannins, you can use yeast derivatives, not to change the product completely, but to make it cleaner. We've seen what tannins and yeasts are for. And I should consider the reactivity and the stages to add tannins and yeast derivatives. With white wines, we do not have any proteins because of the reaction with the tannins, but with white wines, it is different. You could add tannins, but depending on when you do that, you can get different results. And I'm done. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Battistutta. I'd like to give the floor to Mrs. Manara, and she will talk about the longevity of white wines and the key roles of yeast derivatives and tannins. I'd like to thank Professor Battistutta for his presentation. During this part of this module, I will focus on tannins and yeast derivatives in ensuring the longevity of white wines. And the concept of longevity has changed over time. There is a new idea of longevity today, and it is possible to do something in different stages, from master to finished wine.
We're going to focus on to what it is possible to achieve in the final stages of cellaring and storage, aging, and before the final bottling. We will particularly analyze yeast derivatives, one that is particularly efficient in particular, and then some innovative tannins that have proved to be particularly effective in extending the longevity of white wines. Let us begin by discussing yeast derivatives. It is a well-known fact that inactivated yeast as well as fresh lees have an inherent antioxidant capacity, which is associated with the presence of sulfur molecules, the best known of them being glutathione, but also other molecules such as peptides and amino acids such as cysteine. This ability that they have is applicable to both the soluble and the insoluble part of the yeast, and to keep this capacity high, it is important to take good care of the production method as well as the initial grapes. and you can obtain results with different characteristics. The inactivated yeast also has the ability to quickly consume the oxygen in the wine medium, and as we shall see, this can help improving the longevity of white wines.
A very interesting yeast derivative which dissolves oxygen promptly is Harmony Vitality. Here we show what happens in a Glera white wine added with SO2, Harmony Vitality, and glutathione. Harmony Vitality consumes rapidly dissolved oxygen as SO2 does, while we do not have the same effect with GSH. If we consider the outcome in terms of color after 3 months storage, we see that the wine with Harmony Vitality has a lighter color than the one with glutathione. This was also performed on other types of wine, as is the Pinot Grigio here. Again, rapid consumption of oxygen, both dissolved in wine and also present in the head space, which was then dissolved into wine and rapidly consumed. Also in this case, after 1 month of contact, we have a clearer color in the wine treated with Harmony Vitality. Previous tests had been performed with a rather high concentration of product. We also saw that with 3 grams per hectoliter of Harmony Vitality and contact times exceeding only the clarification in terms of being 6 days, obtained or gave us 420 nanometers of yellow color. And this minor intensity of the yellow color was preserved over the course of time, also over the course of several months, and that went for the wine with no addition of yeast derivative, and also in wines added with different yeast derivatives. Then similar tests done with a low dosage, but with 5 weeks of contact, produced similar results. Higher dosages, of course, make it possible to have a better absorption of catechins and polyphenols down to 420 nanometers, and this lower intensity of color is also preserved during the rest of the storage period. Let's now see the effect in terms of the longevity of aromas. This first graph presents the profile of a white wine that was stored without Harmony Vitality. You see the descriptors that pertain to fermentative values, apricot, white flowers, white fruit, and so on and so forth, are more present in the wine with Harmony Vitality, while the more evolved descriptors, hay and honey, are less present after 4 months. We should also consider this case. Here we have similar results in this Greek wine with a higher varietal characteristic. Also in this case, we have the 3MH and 3MH acetate, which are significantly higher in the wine treated with the yeast derivative. Now, here you see a slide which tells us about the capability of the product to preserve against pinking, to defend against pinking. This is data coming from Dr. Fracassetti at University in Milan, and Ms. Fracassetti actually took the floor about this morning. It was very interesting. You see that Harmony Vitality has the capability of absorbing the red color, 500 nanometers in this case, with contact times of approximately 30 days. And this is to a higher extent than other yeast derivatives, and also more. So it has the capability of decreasing susceptibility to pinking of the wine, both when compared to the control wine and the wine added with different derivatives. So Harmony Vitality is the yeast derivative which is indicated during storage and fining or aging to properly manage oxygen and also the color due to polyphenols. This prevents browning in white and this preserves the aromatic fraction. And in this presentation, we have not mentioned yet one aspect which is equally important, which is taste. That there too we have an effect, also depending on the dosage and the time of contact. Let's now consider a far-reaching family of different chemical compounds which are grouped under the name tannins. Tannins and wine interact a lot. Tannins perform a number of complex functions that they can perform in wine as well. As here you see a list of some. They can be interesting during the aging, but also pre-bottling. As for longevity and white, we should consider first and foremost the antioxidant capability of tannins, so their capability to regulate the redox potential, and also the capability of combining metals in the wine medium. We identified here 3 different tannins. Top Tan AR is the first one, and it is a tannin that we suggest adding during storage and aging, and we will see why. It has 2 fractions. One is ellagic, and one comes from the skin of the berry, so it is more condensed. Then we have 2 tannins which are interesting in the pre-bottling phase, which is tannin blanc, gallic, and infinity vert, which comes from tea leaves, green tea leaves. We see that the higher antioxidant power is to be found in tannin blanc, the gallic tannin, while when it comes to the velocity of the oxygen consumption in the model solution, tannins that perform better are the green tea tannin, but also the ellagic fraction of top tan AR. What about the situation when we add tannin to wines? Well, voltammetry helps us in ascertaining that, as Professor Battistutta explained, because it takes into account not only the features and characteristics of the tannins, but also their action in wine. Here in green, you see the base wine, which was not stabilized at the end of the alcohol fermentation, sorry, not fraction, but fermentation. The bluish lines indicate the contribution obtained by adding the ellagic and the condensed fraction of top tan AR, which intends the intensity of current that we saw in the voltammetric track. They, in a way, rejuvenated the wine so that it has reactive compounds that can counter possible oxidation phenomena. The gallic tannin increased the intensity even more, and the same went for the infinity vert from tea. Here we see that there is one fraction that also reacts at very low potential, and it is highly reactive. The picture changes if you add tannins to the second wine before bottling. Here you see that the 2 top tan fractions, as a matter of fact, prove to be less effective because they increase the intensity less while Tanni Blanc and Infinity Vert maintain and keep their features also in stabilized wine. And this is an evidence of the fact that different wines can respond differently when added the very same product. After the tests, we can state that if we want to exploit top 10 AR features at best, we should include it post-alcoholic fermentation rather than pre-bottling, because the features are better preserved in the former case. Let's now consider the consumption of oxygen in pre-bottling tannins with Tanni Blanc and Infinity Vert, therefore. Infinity Vert consumes oxygen more rapidly, which is something that we saw in the model and also in 3 different wines that had been added with the 2 different types of tannins. Specifically, this is something that we saw also in tests made on the Albana wine, where we had added 2 grams per hectoliter of Infinity Vert and Tanni Blanc and SO2. You see in the first graph the consumption of dissolved oxygen that was rather constant. But with Infinity Vert, at a certain point, things accelerated massively, which is possibly due to its more reactive function. Color and intensity of color. There we can see that the Albana test wine, after 6 months after bottling, improved or rather increased its intensity of color 420 nanometers, while the other 3 cases kept a constant color of the white wine. Here you have the result of the tasting panel. You see that when adding Tanni Blanc, after 6 months, still preserved floral notes and more aromatic intensity, and we have more cleanness with Infinity Vert. We asked tasters to tell what they preferred in terms of the nose, and Infinity Vert did better, followed by Tanni Blanc, and then the test wine. And the same goes for the palate. To conclude, we have instruments which are effective and which can improve the longevity of whites if used in the aging and also pre-bottling phases. Irrespective of the complexity that comes from the fact that you add a foreign component to different wines. During those phases, we can use a yeast derivative, harmony, vitality, and analogic and or condensed tannin, such as top 10 AR. Their features entail that they consume oxygen very rapidly, so they can be used during racking off when the presence of oxygen can be more marked. During bottling, the additions of a Gallic tannin, Tanni Blanc, proved more interesting due to its very high antioxidant power, which prevents organoleptic changes. The alternative is Infinity Vert from tea, which has a very reactive fraction, so much so that it protects highly the organoleptic features of the wine. Of course, these protocols and studies can be used also with an idea to reducing sulfite in wine. Thank you very much for your attention. This marks the end of my presentation.